Welcome to the Missing Docs channel. Today, after visiting Jannat al-Baqi Cemetery, just remembered about Imam Muhammad ibn Ali al-Baqir, d. 733 CE, and just remembered about heated debate during my PhD resec, times which some ex-Muslims and atheists asked very strong questions.
Yeah, it is a place that really carries this incredible, almost overwhelming physical and emotional weight, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It really does.
Like when you just stand there, right in the dust of Medina, you are looking at the resting place of figures who entirely shaped the trajectory of Islamic history.
Right.
Yet their actual lived experiences were, well, often surrounded by intense controversy, lethal persecution, and this profound intellectual struggle that we sometimes just gloss over today.
Exactly. And honestly, that memory of standing there really sets the stage for what we are doing today.
Mhm.
Because I want you, the listener, to just imagine something for a second. Imagine you are the sole surviving male heir to a completely decimated political and spiritual dynasty.
That's a heavy burden.
It is. Your family was systematically slaughtered in a battle you literally witnessed as a young child.
Right, at Karbala.
Yeah. And now you are living under this absolute surveillance state that actively wants you, and honestly, anyone who follows you, dead.
They were hunting them down.
They really were. So the question is, do you pick up a sword and die a martyr? Or do you sit down, stay quiet, and try to hack the intellectual foundation of the empire from the inside?
And that is the ultimate question of his life, really.
Yeah.
And it is not an easy one to answer, especially when the historians start analyzing it. Yeah.
Right. And today we are bringing you into a 1,300-year-old debate. We are looking at this truly massive academic document compiled by a dual PhD Islamic scholar and historian.
It's a fascinating piece of work.
It really is. What this document does is pretty audacious. It takes 100 of the most critical, taboo, and just skeptical questions about Imam al-Baqir.
They're really tough ones.
Yeah, the questions raised by ex-Muslims, atheists, secular historians, and various rival Islamic sects. And it faces them head-on.
It doesn't shy away at all?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't shy away from the accusations that his followers invented his status or, that his influence somehow negatively fractured early Islam.
And our mission here is strictly impartial. I want to make that very clear right from the start.
Absolutely.
We are not here to take sides in these ancient sectarian or religious debates, nor are we here to preach.
Right, that's not what we do.
Exactly. Our goal is to lay out exactly what these historical critics ask, and to look at how classical and modern scholars have historically defended al-Baqir's legacy.
The thing is, we want to understand the actual mechanics of the arguments on all sides. We are looking at the sociology, the theology, and the history.
But before we get into the really explosive debates...
And believe me, we are going to get into some wild stuff. Claims of secret Qur'ans, fabricated lineages, all of it.
Right, but we need some grounding first.
Right.
Because if you don't know who this man was, none of these critiques will even make sense.
Exactly. So who exactly was Imam Muhammad ibn Ali al-Baqir?
Well, chronologically, we are looking at a man who lived from roughly 676 to 733 CE.
Okay.
And if you know your Islamic history, this places his entire life squarely under the rule of the Umayyad dynasty.
Which, for those who might not be super familiar with the political timeline, was essentially the first great Islamic empire ruling out of Damascus.
Right.
They were incredibly powerful, very expansive, and honestly often entirely ruthless in how they maintained their grip on the state.
Highly ruthless. They had a massive intelligence network.
Oh, yeah.
They had this postal system called the Barid that basically doubled as a spy agency.
Yeah.
And they had absolutely zero tolerance for political dissent.
None at all.
Now, to understand al-Baqir's place in this, you really have to understand his lineage. Because his lineage was the very reason he had a permanent target on his back.
Right, the bloodline.
Exactly. He was the great-grandson of Imam Ali. His father was Ali Zain al-Abidin, who was, the only adult male of Imam Hussein's family to survive the massacre at Karbala.
So the trauma is immediate, it's generational.
Completely. And his mother was Fatima bint al-Hassan.
Okay, why is that significant?
This is crucial, because it means al-Baqir was the very first figure to unite the descent from both of the Prophet's grandsons, Hassan and Hussein.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, in a society where tribal lineage and prophetic bloodline were, like the ultimate forms of social capital, his physical existence was an undeniable political statement.
It's a serious pedigree.
Tremendous. But as I said, it made him an existential threat to the Umayyads simply by breathing.
Right.
In the 12 Shia tradition, he is revered as the fifth divinely appointed infallible Imam.
And at the same time, in the Sunni tradition, he's highly respected too, right?
Yes, absolutely. He is viewed as a remarkably trustworthy hadith transmitter and one of the preeminent scholars of Medina.
So you have this child who survives absolute devastation. He grows up under an oppressive regime that views his family's existence as a ticking time bomb.
A constant threat.
Yeah. Standing in that cemetery, it just brings up the immediate reality of what it must have felt like to live under that kind of surveillance.
It must have been terrifying.
Which brings us right into the very first major critique that skeptics level against him. And honestly, it's a critique that hits hard because it directly challenges his courage.
Yes.
Let's talk about his political silence.
The tension between the sword and the pen. It is the classic dilemma of religious leadership under tyranny.
Right. And I want to give the skeptic's argument some real room to breathe here because it's not just some fringe critique.
No, it was very common.
Secular historians, ex-Muslims, and even some activist Shia of his own time, specifically the Zaydis, who were essentially the militant wing of his own family.
Right. They were the fighters.
They ask a very pointed question. Why didn't al-Baqir revolt?
They looked at the Umayyads, saw corrupt, tyrannical usurpers, and wondered why the supposed rightful leader was just sitting in Medina teaching classes.
The thing is, if you claim to be the rightful divine guide of the community, sitting back while tyrants rule looks a lot like complicity.
It does to an outside observer.
Because the Zaydis were actually picking up swords, bleeding, and dying to overthrow the Umayyads.
They were actively resisting.
So from a secular or critical perspective, it's like having the absolute cure to a deadly disease, but refusing to leave your house to distribute it to the people dying in the streets out of fear for your own safety.
That's a harsh analogy, but it's exactly how they saw it.
If you are the ultimate leader, why are you letting your followers be persecuted and slaughtered while you live quietly in the Hijaz? Was his political quietism actually just cowardice masquerading as piety?
That is exactly how his contemporary critics framed it. They demanded a militant messiah.
They wanted a warrior.
Right, but the classical and modern scholars pushed back on this heavily by pointing out the grim, unromantic reality of the 8th century political landscape.
It wasn't exactly a fair fight.
Not at all. You cannot analyze al-Baqir's choices without looking at the military mathematics of the era.
Which were terrible for his family.
Beyond terrible. I mean, al-Baqir survived Karbala as a child. He intimately knew what state-sponsored slaughter looked like.
He saw it firsthand.
He did. And after Karbala, there were other uprisings trying to avenge his family, like the revolt of al-Mukhtar, and later the uprising of his own half-brother Zayd.
Which is where the Zaydis get their name, right?
Exactly.
And how did those end? I'm guessing badly.
Every single one of them ended in a complete bloodbath.
Wow.
The Umayyad military machine was professional, massive, and entirely willing to massacre entire cities to maintain order.
They didn't mess around.
No. And the military infrastructure of the Alids, the descendants of Ali, was completely non-existent.
So they just had no chance.
They had passion, but they did not have armies, supply lines, or broad, unified coalitions.
So a revolt wouldn't have been a heroic liberation. It would have been a suicide mission.
Exactly. Classical scholars like Sheikh al-Mufid argue that another armed uprising wouldn't just have failed politically.
What would have happened?
It would have resulted in the complete and total biological annihilation of the Prophet's remaining family. There would be no one left.
That's a chilling thought.
SubhanAllah, al-Baqir understood that the real battle wasn't for political territory anymore. That ship had sailed.
So what was his strategy then?
His survival strategy was a deliberate, agonizing shift from military jihad to intellectual jihad.
Intellectual jihad. Explain how that functions as a strategy, because to a skeptic, intellectual jihad just sounds like a convenient excuse to stay out of the fight.
It functions on the premise that ideas outlast empires.
Okay.
He recognized that the Umayyads weren't just killing people, they were controlling the narrative.
Right. State propaganda.
Exactly. They were actively shaping the religious framework, the jurisprudence, and the theology of the empire to justify their own absolute rule.
They were manipulating the religion itself.
Yes. So al-Baqir realized that if the intellectual and theological core of Islam wasn't preserved, then even if an Alid army somehow won a miraculous political victory 50 years later, they would be ruling over an empty, corrupted religion.
They would win the throne but lose the faith.
Exactly. So his quietism was a calculated strategic patience. It was about building a foundation of knowledge that was immune to swords.
Okay, let's unpack this mechanism, because the strategy he used to survive and teach brings us to one of the most fiercely controversial concepts in Islamic history.
I think I know where you're going with this.
Taqiyya.
Ah, yes. Prudential dissimulation. The art of concealing one's true beliefs.
And let's be honest, from the perspective of an outsider or a strict rationalist, this looks incredibly suspicious.
It does.
Critics look at taqiyya and they don't see a noble survival tactic. They call it a liar's charter.
They argue it destroys the reliability of everything he says.
Right. If I am an ex-Muslim or a secular historian looking at this, I'm thinking, wait, so you have a religious loophole that allows you to lie about what you believe whenever you feel threatened.
That's a common critique.
Doesn't this completely destroy any trust in your teachings? How do I know when you are telling the truth and when you are just using taqiyya? They argue it just creates a culture of deception and cowardice.
It is a very heavy charge, and historically, it has been used to completely dismiss Shia jurisprudence.
So how do the scholars defend it?
The scholarly defense is fascinating because it relies heavily on the Qur'an itself, not just later interpretations. They point out that taqiyya is a Qur'anic principle.
Walk me through the mechanics of how it actually works legally. Where does it come from?
The primary textual basis comes from Surah 3, verse 28, and more explicitly Surah 16, verse 106.
What's the context for that verse?
It was revealed specifically regarding a companion of the Prophet named Ammar ibn Yasir.
Okay.
Ammar was being brutally tortured by the polytheists in Mecca, and to save his life, he verbally denounced the Prophet.
Oh, wow.
He came to the Prophet later, weeping and broken, thinking he was damned.
I mean, you can imagine the guilt.
Exactly. But the Quranic revelation explicitly pardoned him, stating that someone who is compelled to disbelieve, while their heart remains firm in faith, incurs no wrath from God.
So the precedent is set right there. God prefers you alive with a secret faith than dead for a public slogan.
Precisely. The preservation of life is a higher maqasid, a higher objective of Islamic law, than the public declaration of a specific theological stance.
Okay.
So it is not a general license to just lie whenever it's socially convenient or to win a debate.
It's not for getting out of paying taxes.
No, not at all. It is a highly restricted, extreme legal dispensation for survival.
You really have to immerse yourself in the paranoia of the Umayyad surveillance state, don't you?
You do. In places like Kufa in Iraq, if an informant heard you openly praising Imam Ali or identifying as a follower of al-Baqir, you could literally be executed without a trial.
Just for a conversation.
Yes. Your house could be burned down. Taqiyya was an underground resistance tactic. It was how you passed messages, how you organized community support, without triggering the state's tripwires.
But hold on. Let me play devil's advocate here.
Go ahead.
If it's a survival tactic, where is the line? Could al-Baqir have theoretically used taqiyya to, say, assist the Umayyads in killing someone else to save his own skin?
That is the crucial boundary, and it's a brilliant question because al-Baqir himself addressed it directly.
He did, yes.
He explicitly forbade the use of taqiyya in matters where it would harm innocent others. The famous legal maxim he established was, taqiyya was only legislated to save blood. Therefore, when it comes to the shedding of blood, there is no taqiyya.
Wow. So you cannot kill someone to save yourself and claim this dispensation?
Absolutely not. The moment your self-preservation requires the unjust death of another, the dispensation evaporates. You must accept death.
I never thought about it that way. It reframes the entire concept. It stops looking like cowardice and starts looking like the operational security of a heavily persecuted underground network.
Exactly. It was about community survival, not personal convenience.
And we actually know historically that he wasn't just hiding in the shadows trembling. He had moments where he completely dropped the veil, which brings up one of my favorite anecdotes in the sources.
Ah, the archery contest.
Yes, the archery contest. It completely disrupts the whole cowardice narrative. Can you set the scene for this?
Caliph Hisham ibn al-Malik. It is such a vivid, almost cinematic moment in the historical records.
It really is.
So, Caliph Hisham was one of the more severe Umayyad rulers. He summoned al-Baqir from Medina to his court in Damascus.
That's a long trip just to be intimidated.
It was. Now, you have to picture the Umayyad court. It is designed to be intimidating. Massive architecture, armed guards, the smell of heavy incense, courtiers draped in silk.
Just overwhelming power.
Right, and Hisham wants to humiliate al-Baqir publicly to diminish his standing among the elites.
So he forces an old man into a sporting event.
Right. Hisham and his courtiers are shooting arrows at a target. When al-Baqir enters, Hisham demands that he take a bow and join them.
The psychological pressure there is immense.
It is. The expectation is that this quiet, elderly scholar from Medina who spends his life in the mosque, is going to completely embarrass himself with a weapon.
Which would prove what?
It would prove to the court that the Alids are weak and out of touch with martial leadership, that they aren't fit to rule.
It was a calculated psychological trap. If he refuses, he looks weak and disobedient.
Exactly.
And if he participates and misses, he looks pathetic.
Right. But the sources record that al-Baqir doesn't flinch.
He just steps up.
He takes the bow, he draws an arrow, fires it, and it hits the absolute dead center of the bullseye.
Which is surprising enough for an elderly scholar.
But he doesn't stop there. He takes a second arrow, fires it, and splits the shaft of the first arrow.
No way.
The third splitting the second. The sources say he fired 9 arrows consecutively, each splitting the one before it.
It's an insane display of physical precision.
It was a display of absolute physical and spiritual mastery right in the heart of the Umayyad power structure.
What was Hisham's reaction?
The sources note that Hisham was visibly terrified. He realized in that moment that al-Baqir wasn't quiet because he was weak. He was quiet because he was disciplined.
It's a statement. He's saying, I could do this, but I choose not to.
Exactly. He could look the most powerful man in the world in the eye, assert his absolute dignity, and walk away without raising a sword against the state. His quietism was a choice, a restraint.
And because he made that monumental choice to survive, to endure, to outthink rather than to fight a doomed war, the focus of his life naturally shifted.
He had to build something else.
Right. He wasn't building a physical army. He was building a theological and intellectual empire. But there's a massive risk in building an isolated intellectual empire.
How so?
Well, if you are claiming exclusive spiritual authority, skeptics are immediately going to analyze your motives. Which leads us to explore whether he was the genuine architect of a theology, or if he simply invented a sect for his own gain.
This is where the secular sociological critiques get incredibly sharp, and we have to examine them honestly.
We do. Secular academics, sociologists of religion, and rival sects look at the core Sikh concept of Nas.
The divine designation.
Right, this idea that the Imam is explicitly chosen by God and is infallible in his religious guidance. And they ask a very cynical, but honestly very logical question.
Did he make it all up?
Did al-Baqir just invent this concept to secure power, money, and social prestige?
It's the classic reductionist critique of religious hierarchies.
The argument goes like this. Al-Baqir realizes he doesn't have the military power to claim the temporal caliphate. He can't sit on the throne in Damascus.
What does he do?
Exactly. What does a smart, ambitious man do? He invents a secondary, invisible throne.
A spiritual one.
He creates a theology that says, actually, political power doesn't matter. Spiritual authority is what matters, and I am uniquely, divinely appointed to hold it. It's a brilliant pivot if you're a con man.
And honestly, critics look at his famous title, al-Baqir, which translates to the splitter of knowledge, and they say this is just excellent post-hoc marketing.
The splitter of knowledge does sound like a great PR slogan.
They argue that this title was back-projected by his zealous followers decades or centuries later to make him look like a superhuman scholar, retrospectively validating this invented spiritual hierarchy.
But when we look at the historical data, does that skeptical argument hold water?
When you look at the scholarly defense and the actual historical reality of his interactions, that reductionist argument starts to fracture.
Why?
Because the title al-Baqir and his reputation for absolute intellectual supremacy wasn't just an internal Shia echo chamber claim. It wasn't just his devoted followers writing pamphlets about how smart he was.
Who else was validating him?
The very people who theologically disagreed with him. Mainstream Sunni masters of hadith and early jurisprudence.
Really? Like who?
We are talking about giant figures in Islamic history. People like Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, who was one of the greatest early Sunni hadith collectors and closely tied to the Umayyad court.
Okay, that's significant.
And people like Abu Hanifa, the founder of the Hanafi school of law, which is the largest Sunni school of jurisprudence today.
Wait, Abu Hanifa interacted with him?
He did. He sat with him, debated with him, and openly respected his peerless depth of knowledge.
Oh, wow.
Later Sunni scholars, like al-Dahabi, who was a famously strict, almost ruthless hadith critic, wrote glowing assessments of al-Baqir's trustworthiness, his piety, and his profound intellect.
Okay, that's a huge piece of evidence. You don't get that kind of glowing cross-sectarian praise in the highly polarized environment of early Islam unless the intellectual caliber is undeniably real.
Exactly.
If he was just a con man inventing a cult, Abu Hanifa and al-Zuhri would have seen right through him and denounced him.
They recognized a master when they saw one. Furthermore, the sources record that the title al-Baqir didn't originate with his followers at all.
Really? Where did it come from?
Both Sunni and Shia classical sources record that the title was actually prophesied by the Prophet Muhammad himself long before al-Baqir was even born.
Wait, how does that work?
The Prophet reportedly had a conversation with a prominent companion named Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari.
Okay.
The Prophet told Jabir that he would live a very long life, long enough to meet a descendant of his from the line of Hussein, whose name would be Muhammad, and who would split knowledge open. The Arabic phrase is Yabakur al-Imbakran.
And he told Jabir to do what?
The Prophet instructed Jabir to convey his personal greetings to this future descendant.
And did Jabir live long enough?
He did. He lived to be a very old blind man in Medina, and the historical accounts say that when al-Baqir was a young boy, Jabir recognized him, delivered the Prophet's greeting, and publicly called him al-Baqir.
Wow. So to the believers, this wasn't a self-selected marketing alias or a later invention.
No, it was the fulfillment of a prophetic mandate.
That definitely complicates the invented PR narrative.
It does.
But let's look at the other side of this cynical coin, the money.
Yes.
Because wherever there is religious authority, there is usually a financial mechanism. What about the materialist critique? The argument that all of this theological architecture was really just an elaborate scheme to collect khums.
The 20% religious tax.
Exactly, the tax that Shia Muslims pay to the Imam. Critics say he just wanted to live a life of comfortable luxury while his followers suffered in Kufa.
It's a common critique applied to almost all religious leaders who collect tithes. Follow the money, right?
Right. So what does the history say?
The historical evidence regarding al-Baqir's daily life, his sociology, contradicts the wealthy con man theory entirely.
How so?
The sources comprehensively show that he lived a remarkably ascetic lifestyle. He was essentially under severe economic embargoes by the Umayyad state.
So he was struggling financially?
He worked with his own hands on a small piece of land outside Medina in the scorching heat.
Oh, wow, manual labor.
There are accounts of him sweating in the fields, and when people asked why a man of his stature was doing manual labor, he replied that working to sustain one's family is a form of worship.
So he wasn't exactly lounging in a silk-lined palace counting gold coins.
Far from it. And what about the wealth that did come to him through religious taxes and donations?
Yeah, where did that go?
The records show he didn't hoard it for personal luxury. He functioned as a one-man welfare state in Medina.
Really?
He constantly redistributed that wealth to the poor, to the widows, and critically, to the persecuted, impoverished families of his followers who had been disenfranchised by the Umayyads.
So the money was constantly flowing out as fast as it came in.
Exactly. And think about the basic logic of the critique. If his ultimate cynical goal was personal wealth and political power, adopting a quietist underground stance was a terrible strategy.
It kept him under constant lethal government suspicion.
And it entirely excluded him from the massive Umayyad state treasury.
Right. If you want to get rich in the 8th century, you don't declare yourself the hidden spiritual leader of an oppressed minority.
No, you flatter the caliph.
You join the Umayyad court, become a state-sponsored judge, and collect a massive government salary.
Precisely. The sociological reality of his life simply doesn't map onto this cynical materialist critique. The sacrifices he made only make sense if he genuinely believed in his spiritual mission.
But to fulfill that spiritual mission, al-Baqir had to definitively answer how his followers should relate to the text of the Qur'an and to the early Islamic community.
And this is where things get really intense.
Because once you start claiming exclusive divine guidance, people want to know what you think about everyone else.
Exactly.
Which brings us to some of the most explosive, taboo, sectarian debates in the entire research paper.
Yes, we're entering the historical minefield of early Islamic politics and textual integrity.
Let's start with the absolute most incendiary claim. Skeptics, particularly Salafi critics of Shiism and ex-Muslims looking to highlight fatal contradictions in Islamic unity, ask a very specific question.
Okay.
Did al-Baqir teach the existence of a secret Qur'an?
Ah, the accusation regarding the Mushaf of Fatima.
Right. The critique is that al-Baqir taught that the standard Qur'an, the one every Muslim reads today, is corrupted or incomplete.
And that the true text is a secret book kept only by the Imams.
Exactly. If I'm an outsider and I hear that a site has a secret, different version of the Holy Book, my immediate conclusion is that they are entirely outside the bounds of the mainstream religion. How does the academic document handle this?
It addresses it head-on because it is an accusation based on a profound, sometimes deliberate, linguistic misunderstanding of the source material.
Linguistic misunderstanding.
Yes, the expert consensus across classical Shia scholarship strictly clarifies this. The Mushaf of Fatima is indeed a highly revered concept in their tradition.
Okay.
But it is categorically explicitly described as not being a Quran.
Break that down. If it's called a mushaf, doesn't that mean Quran?
Today, yes, the word Mushaf is almost exclusively synonymous with a physical copy of the Quran.
Right, that's how everyone uses it.
But linguistically, in the 7th and 8th centuries, the word Mushaf simply meant a bound collection of pages. It just meant a book or a codex.
Oh, so it's a semantic shift over time that causes the confusion.
Exactly. So what was the Mushaf of Fatima? The classical sources, like Al-Kulani and the foundational hadith collection Al-Kafi, describe it as a book of prophecies, future events, and profound consolation.
Where did it come from?
The tradition holds that after the Prophet Muhammad died, his daughter Fatima was in a state of profound, overwhelming grief.
Which makes sense.
To console her, God sent the angel Jibril Gabriel to speak to her. Her husband, Imam Ali, acted as the scribe and wrote down what the angel revealed.
And what did the angel reveal? Was it laws? Verses?
No. The sources are explicit that it does not contain a single verse of Islamic law halal and haram or any Quranic revelations.
So what's in it?
It was about the future fate of her descendants and words of comfort. It is a completely separate complementary text. It is not an alternate version of the Quran at all.
That makes a massive difference.
It does. In fact, to permanently close the door on the corrupted Quran accusation, al-Baqir himself and mainstream Shia scholars through the centuries explicitly and repeatedly affirmed the absolute integrity of the Uthmanic Quran.
The standard compilation used globally today.
Yes.
Is there a specific quote from al-Baqir on this?
Yes. He is recorded as saying, quite bluntly, "Whoever claims the Quran we have is not what Allah revealed as a liar."
Wow. You cannot get a more unambiguous defense of textual integrity than that.
Exactly.
Okay, so that completely clears up the text. The Quran is the Quran, but what about the people? Specifically the early caliphs.
The political figures.
Did al-Baqir curse Abu Bakr, Umar, and the Prophet's wife Aisha? This is the root of so much historical and modern sectarian tension. Did he teach his followers to hate the founders of the mainstream Sunni political order?
Here is where the document reveals a striking, almost mind-bending historical detail that completely disrupts the simplistic black and white sectarian narratives we often hear today.
What is it?
We have to look at al-Baqir's literal biological family tree.
Okay.
Al-Baqir's own mother, Farwa, was the great-granddaughter of the first caliph, Abu Bakr.
Wait, stop.
It's true.
The man who is revered as the fifth infallible Shia Imam, the ultimate authority for those who believe Ali should have been the first caliph, is a direct biological descendant of Abu Bakr.
Yes. Through his mother's side, he descends from Abu Bakr through two different lines.
That's wild.
Al-Baqir was fully aware of this and did not hide it. In fact, he is recorded as famously saying, "Abu Bakr sired me twice."
That is incredible. I never thought about it that way. It completely shatters the idea of this absolute unbridgeable blood feud between the families.
It does.
It's actually pretty simple when you look at it sociologically. You can separate a profound theological and political disagreement from visceral personal hatred.
You don't curse your own family.
Exactly.
That is exactly the scholarly defense. The theological stance that Imam Ali was the rightful immediate successor to the Prophet is fiercely maintained. Al-Baqir believed that entirely. But that theological stance doesn't translate into the simplistic, vitriolic caricature of constant cursing that critics often portray.
The document mentions a specific conceptual difference to explain his behavior. The difference between bara and sab.
Yes, those are key terms.
Can you explain the mechanics of those two terms? Because they seem crucial here.
They are the absolute key to understanding his entire approach to early Islamic history. Bara translates roughly to distancing oneself or disavowal.
Okay.
It means formally, intellectually, and theologically disagreeing with actions you believe are unjust. It is a principled stance.
You are saying I disavow the political decisions made at that time because they contradicted divine guidance.
Right. And what is sab?
Yeah, what is that?
Sab means vulgar cursing, personal insults, obscenity, or vilifying personalities in the streets.
So you can say, I completely disagree with how this empire was formed and the decisions these leaders made, without screaming profanities about them in public.
Correct. Al-Baqir strictly forbade his followers from being cursers. He taught bara, a principled intellectual distancing rather than sap.
Because sab just causes trouble.
He viewed it as behavior that only incites mob violence and degrades the spiritual character of the believer doing the cursing.
His entire focus was forward-looking, the restoration of the Prophet's original sunnah, the authentic practice, rather than getting bogged down in inciting sectarian gang warfare over the past.
Exactly.
But here's the catch. This restoration of the sunnah wasn't just abstract politics or history. It bled into everyday physical rituals.
It always does.
And when you start tweaking the daily rituals that people have been doing a certain way for decades, you attract intense visceral scrutiny. Because ritual is the physical manifestation of theology.
When the physical actions change, the average person on the street notices immediately.
Absolutely. Which brings us to the legal differences, the fiqh, that skeptics use to accuse al-Baqir of needlessly complicating Islam just to create sectarian markers.
Let's look at a prime example.
Yeah.
Wudu, the pre-prayer ablution.
Right. The vast majority of the Islamic world washes their feet during wudu. Al-Baqir taught his followers to wipe the top of their feet with wet hands.
Yes.
To a critic, this looks like he's just being different for the sake of being different, creating a visual us versus them marker. Was he just innovating?
The scholarly defense here is highly technical, and it proves he wasn't innovating, he was actively restoring.
Oh, so?
He argued that he was purifying the rituals back to the authentic prophetic practice based on two things: the uninterrupted transmission of practice within the Prophet's own household, and a strict grammatical reading of the Qur'an itself.
Break down the grammar for me. How does the Qur'anic Arabic justify wiping instead of washing?
It comes down to Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 6, which outlines the steps of wudu. The verse says to wash your faces and your hands up to the elbows, and then it says, Wamsahu by ru'usikum wa arjulakum, wipe your heads and your feet.
So where's the debate?
The grammatical debate hinges on the vowels on the word for feet, arjul.
Okay, this is getting deep into the weeds, but I love it. Explain the vowels.
If you read the word with the kasra arjulakum, it grammatically connects to the command to wipe the head.
Okay.
If you read it with a fatha arjulakum, Sunni grammarians argue it connects back to the earlier command to wash the hands.
Oh, I see.
Al-Baqir, leaning on the familial practice of Imam Ali and specific Arabic grammatical rules regarding proximity, argued that both readings logically and linguistically mandate wiping, not washing.
So where did washing come from then?
He argued that the practice of washing became standard later, possibly due to external cultural influences or later caliphal decrees, not prophetic instruction.
So it wasn't a petty sectarian marker. It was a rigorous, text-based legal argument.
Exactly. It was high-level jurisprudence.
Let's tackle another massive legal controversy, mutha, or temporary marriage.
That is a big one.
It is heavily criticized by Sunni scholars who believe it was permanently outlawed, and modern secularists often view it incredibly harshly, comparing it to legalized exploitation. How did al-Baqir defend this?
Al-Baqir's defense rested primarily on the fact that it was a clear, unambiguous Qur'anic permission in Surah An-Nisa.
And it was practiced early on, right?
Yes, it was practiced during the Prophet's lifetime and during the reign of Abu Bakr. He argued that it was the second caliph, Umar, who outlawed it based on a state decree, not a divine abrogation.
So what's the theological argument?
Therefore, as an imam, al-Baqir could not forbid what God had permitted.
But what about the secular critique, the sociological reality of it?
Modern sociologists analyzing early Islamic history argue that temporary marriage was actually a pragmatic, regulated social solution intended for a society that was in a state of constant war, expansion, and travel.
You're talking about soldiers stationed far from home, merchants on long trade routes.
Yes. And critically, you had a massive population of widows due to constant warfare who had no social safety net.
Ah, I hadn't thought of that.
Muta provided a legally binding, regulated framework with clear financial rights, like the Mahr, and established paternity rights for any children born.
So it wasn't just a free-for-all.
Not at all. It brought a social reality under the umbrella of law, rather than allowing society to fall into unregulated underground exploitation where women had zero legal recourse.
Al-Baqir was preserving a complex legal tool.
Exactly.
Okay, those are the legal and ritual debates. You can argue grammar and history all day, but let's push hard on the metaphysical claims.
The really tough stuff.
Because this is where the atheists, the secularists, and the strict rationalists really dig their heels in. The texts claim al-Baqir had knowledge of the unseen or gave him.
The realm of the supernatural.
Right. He supposedly knew what people were thinking or knew future events before they happened.
Yet there are many accounts of this.
And the thing is, in Islam, claiming someone has independent knowledge of the unseen sounds a lot like associating partners with God, which is the ultimate sin of shirk.
It is a very serious theological claim.
If God is the all-knowing, how can a man in Medina know the unseen? How do classical scholars defend this against atheists and strict monotheists who say his followers basically turned him into a minor deity?
It is a profound theological challenge, and if misunderstood, it absolutely borders on shirk.
So how do they explain it?
But the scholarly defense hinges on a highly specific and crucial theological distinction regarding the nature of knowledge itself. The theologians divide knowledge into two categories:
Which are?
essential knowledge, dati, and bestowed, or moebi knowledge.
Unpack those two categories for me. What is essential knowledge?
Essential knowledge is intrinsic. It belongs to the being by its very nature. It is uncaused and infinite.
Okay.
In Islamic theology, only Allah possesses essential knowledge of the unseen. He knows it independently simply because He is God. No one shares this with Him.
Okay, so what is bestowed knowledge?
Bestowed knowledge is granted. It is transferred, limited insight. When the Shia sources claim al-Baqir had knowledge of the unseen, they are absolutely not saying he possessed it independently like a god.
What are they saying then?
They are saying Allah chose, in specific moments, to pull back the veil and reveal certain unseen realities to His chosen representative to aid in His mission.
Yeah. It makes me think of an analogy. It's like the sun and the moon.
That's a good one.
The sun generates its own light intrinsically. It is a star. The moon doesn't generate a single photon of light itself. It merely reflects the light bestowed upon it by the sun.
That is a perfect, highly accurate analogy for how the theologians explain it.
When we see the moon glowing, we don't accuse it of claiming to be a star.
The Imam's knowledge is lunar, God's knowledge is solar. And structurally, the scholars point out a very important defense.
Which is?
This mechanism is absolutely identical to how mainstream Sunni Islam, and indeed Christianity and Judaism, view the miracles and knowledge granted to prophets.
Give me an example.
When the prophet Joseph Yusuf interpreted dreams to predict a 7-year famine, or when the prophet Jesus Isa told people what they were eating in their homes, they weren't committing shirk.
Because they weren't claiming the power was theirs.
Exactly. They were acting as conduits for divine bestowed knowledge. Al-Baqir's followers simply argued that this mechanism of bestowed knowledge didn't end with the prophets. It continued with the Imams.
That makes logical sense within the theological framework.
Yeah.
But here is the massive, undeniable problem, and it leads us into one of the darkest chapters of this history.
I know exactly what you're about to say.
When you preach that there is esoteric knowledge, that there are hidden layers to the Qur'an, and that you have a bestowed mystical connection to the divine, you inevitably attract followers who take things way, way too far.
Yes. You open Pandora's box.
Which brings us to the extremist problem, the gulat, the exaggerator.
This is one of the most fascinating and dangerous socio-religious dynamics of the 8th century.
Skeptics, atheists, and rival sects ask a devastatingly fair question here. It might be the strongest critique in the whole document.
It's definitely one of the hardest to defend.
If al-Baqir was a divine, infallible guide, a master of intellectual jihad, why did his own inner circle, his own professed students, spawn some of the most dangerous, heretical, extremist cults in Islamic history?
We're talking about groups that literally claimed he was a demigod,
Right.
that the Imams controlled the weather, or that the Imams never actually died.
If I am an outsider looking at this, it's like seeing a brilliant software engineer write a new operating system, but because he makes it open source, malicious hackers immediately come in, write devastating viruses into the code, and release it under his name.
That's a great modern analogy.
Why couldn't he secure his own network? Why couldn't he control his own classroom?
To understand the rise of the Gulat, we have to look at the sociology and the geography of the 8th century. Where were these cults forming?
Where were they?
Primarily in Kufa, in Iraq. Al-Baqir was in Medina, hundreds of miles away, across a harsh desert. Communication took weeks.
So there's a massive physical disconnect.
Yes. And Kufa at that time was a powder keg of ideas. It was a cosmopolitan melting pot where you had fresh Islamic theology crashing into ancient Babylonian mysticism, Persian Gnosticism, and Christian ideas of incarnation.
Sounds like the ancient internet.
It really was. Add to that the intense political desperation of the oppressed underclass, who were desperate for a magical savior to destroy the Umayyads.
A perfect storm for a cult.
Exactly. So when al-Baqir legitimately taught that the Imams possessed special bestowed knowledge and spiritual authority, these opportunists and unstable figures in Iraq took that framework and stretched it to absurd heretical extremes to build their own followings.
They essentially franchised his name without his permission.
Yeah.
But did al-Baqir know about it? And more importantly, what did he do about it? Because if he just sat back and let it happen, the critique holds.
The historical record of al-Baqir's reaction is what dismantles the critique. He did not tolerate it.
What did he do?
He explicitly, publicly, and forcefully went to war against these extremists within his own ranks.
Can you give me specific examples? Who were these hackers?
One of the most notorious was a man named al-Mughira ibn Sa'id.
What did he do?
He started claiming that al-Baqir was divine, and he began forging hadiths, fake sayings, and slipping them into the notebooks of al-Baqir's legitimate students.
Literally putting fake notes into their book.
Yes. When al-Baqir found out, the sources say he was furious. He publicly cursed al-Mughira, excommunicated him, and warned all his followers to completely boycott him and anyone associated with him.
He didn't just disagree, he cut them off like a tumor.
Completely. He recognized that the Gulat were more dangerous to Islam than the Umayyad army.
Why?
Because the Umayyads could only kill your body. The Gulat could destroy your religion from the inside.
But excommunicating one guy doesn't solve the systemic problem of forged information circulating in your name. How did he patch the software? How did he stop the viruses?
This is where al-Baqir demonstrates his absolute brilliance as a legal and theological architect. He established a rigorous, unbending foundational rule for all of his students and for anyone transmitting his hadith.
He gave them an antivirus protocol.
Exactly. He said, if a narration from me contradicts the Qur'an, strike it against the wall.
Strike it against the wall. That is such a visceral, aggressive, physical standard for textual criticism.
It means reject it utterly. Do not entertain it. Do not try to interpret it metaphorically.
Wow.
If it clashes with the clear text of the Qur'an, it is a forgery, even if it has my name on it. Alhamdulillah, this methodology became the absolute gold standard for Shia hadith evaluation.
But the document points out a deep historical irony here, doesn't it?
It does. The irony is that the very theological space al-Baqir created by emphasizing esoteric, bestowed knowledge was the exact vulnerability these opportunists tried to exploit.
Because if there's secret knowledge, anyone can show up in Iraq and say, hey, the Imam whispered a secret to me, give me your money.
Right. But al-Baqir's strict methodology, forcing every esoteric claim to be slammed against the harsh, objective light of the Qur'an, became the mechanism his true followers use to root out these fabrications over the next several centuries.
He provided the disease's cure within his own system.
He did.
And this rigorous sorting of fact from fabrication, of stripping away the extreme mythologies to find the core truth, leads us perfectly into the final perspective of this document.
Yes, the modern academic view.
We've talked about the theology, the sect, the miracles, but how do we look at him today through a modern lens?
This is where we step outside the purely theological frameworks and ask the secular academic question.
Right, the ultimate secular humanist question raised by the text. If we strip away the theology, if we remove the miracles, the claims of divine designation, the bestowed knowledge of the unseen, what does a modern historian actually conclude about Imam Muhammad al-Baqir?
Does he disappear into myth?
Right.
Is he just a quiet man who got turned into a legend?
Right.
The academic consensus, utilizing strict historical critical methods, is a resounding no. He does not disappear.
What do they look at?
The document heavily references prominent modern academic scholars like Arzina Lalani and Eitan Kohlberg, who have spent decades analyzing the raw manuscripts.
And what do these secular historians find when they look at the data?
They conclude that while later generations undoubtedly magnified his theological portrait, adding layers of hagiography, the historical core of al-Baqir's achievement is absolutely undeniable and staggering in its scope.
Staggering how?
Think about what he physically accomplished in his lifetime. He took a community that had been physically decimated, a suppressed, traumatized political protest movement reeling from Karbala, and he transformed them.
He didn't let them just die out as a marginalized, bitter political faction obsessed with a lost throne?
No, he single-handedly turned them into a sustainable, highly sophisticated, enduring intellectual tradition. He gave them a reason to exist beyond just political grievance.
He built a university out of the ashes of a battlefield.
Exactly. He laid the complex foundations for an entirely unique school of jurisprudence, for deep Qur'anic exegesis, and for theological ethics that were robust enough to survive the eventual total collapse of the Umayyad Empire itself.
That's incredible. The Umayyads are gone. Al-Baqir's legal frameworks are still studied by millions today.
Precisely.
What I find so fascinating looking at the academic breakdown of the sources is his heavy emphasis on reason, on aql.
Yes.
The great compilation of Shia hadith, al-Kafi, literally opens with the Book of Reason, thoroughly documenting al-Baqir's teachings on the intellect. He elevated human intellect to the level of an internal prophet.
He recognized that blind emotional faith wouldn't survive the intellectual cosmopolitanism of the rapidly expanding Islamic empire. He demanded rigorous thought from his students.
And that emphasis on reason provided the very tools his followers used to debate the materialists, the atheists, and the philosophers of his own day.
He wasn't an anti-intellectual mystic telling people to just close their eyes and believe.
No, he was actively equipping his students to engage in high-level philosophical combat in the intellectual centers of the world.
And that is exactly why the document concludes with such a powerful unifying observation. Imam al-Baqir is the ultimate bridge figure in early Islamic history.
A bridge between what?
Between different eras, between different methodologies, and between differing traditions.
Explain that.
He is claimed by different groups today for entirely different reasons, which is the hallmark of a monumental historical figure. Mainstream Sunnis claim him as a master of hadith, a towering jurist, and a pious descendant of the Prophet.
Right.
Shia claim him as their infallible divine guide and the architect of their theology. Western academics claim him as a brilliant legal and social strategist.
So the 100 critical questions leveled against him in this document, they don't destroy him.
Not at all. In the crucible of all that intense taboo critique, the questions actually reveal how vital, how completely indispensable he was to the very formation of classical Islamic thought.
You really cannot understand the intellectual history of the Middle East without understanding him.
You can't.
You know, we started this entire conversation talking about standing in the dusty cemetery of Jannat al-Baqi.
We did.
Looking at a physical space that holds so much heavy history. We looked at a man whose entire early life was defined by the traumatic aftermath of the sword, who chose instead to wield the pen.
A seemingly quiet choice that ended up shaping centuries of human thought and jurisprudence.
It really leaves you with something profound to mull over, regardless of your personal theology.
It does.
When we look at all these historical sources, all these intense debates, and all these sharp critiques from atheists and historians, al-Baqir's greatest secular legacy might just be his demonstration that true, enduring resilience isn't always found on a bloody battlefield.
Sometimes the most revolutionary, defiant act a person can commit in the face of absolute, overwhelming tyranny is to sit down, open a book, and teach the next generation exactly how to think.
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.